We have been studying the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, where Sri Aurobindo describes this cosmos as a manifestation of the world bliss, the divine enjoyer himself taking form, himself individualized as the all-blissful divine in disguise, descending into this world bliss to experience all the facets of the bliss, including what is described as the dark facet of the bliss, of Ananda. Sri Aurobindo, in a few aphoristic statements, gives us the solution to the problem of existence and answers many philosophical questions which have troubled the human quest to understand reality and the nature of human suffering. But when he answers them so simply and directly, we tend not to fully appreciate the full context of what has been resolved. And last time, we briefly took up the text from the Life Divine, where Sri Aurobindo discusses the problem and the solution of the delight of existence. Although we started the text of the solution, I thought it worthwhile to also review the chapter titled The Problem, because that's where we understand the full meaning of what has been shown in this text. It seems so simple to state that the whole world is a manifestation of the divine bliss, and what we experience as the opposite of Ananda is only a veiling or a play, and that in our own personality, the divine presence within the jiva, the soul, is always blissful and perceives all experiences as bliss. Why then do we experience suffering in the surface personality? And we've seen the root cause is ignorance, ego, etc. The nature of the liberation by which we recover that bliss is all described in very short aphoristic statements. But the full scope of the problem is not appreciated unless we dwell into the question itself which is being answered. And so we took up that text last time, and today I thought it worth summarizing the chapter titled Delight of Existence, the Problem. And then we will continue with the other chapter, Delight of Existence, the Solution. Because in this chapter we see how many important issues are involved and how simply they're resolved in this vision and experience. In the beginning of this chapter, in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo raises this question: why should Brahman, perfect, absolute, infinite, needing nothing, desiring nothing, at all throw out force of consciousness to create in itself these worlds of forms? And the answer, of course, is it's not that he is compelled, because he is, after all, entirely free. He has within him all potential, but he is not bound by that potential. And if he is free to move or remain eternally still, to throw itself into forms or retain the potentiality of form in itself, it indulges its power of movement and formation. It can only be for one reason: for delight. So the whole solution to the first question, why this universe, why this manifestation? If he is free to remain in stillness, to remain in potential, as well as to throw out in form, why the choice of this manifestation? There is only one reason, he says: for delight. And so, from the perspective, the Vedantic perspective, the ultimate reality is not only existence which is conscious, but consciousness which is blissful. And in this description, we find a gem of an insight which no philosophy so far has really been able to grapple with to satisfaction. He actually reveals the nature of bliss and explains what exactly bliss is. Now, we could of course say it's an experience, it cannot be explained. But what is its origin? What is its essential character? And there's something here which is extraordinary, and he makes just a quick passing reference to it. He says, as in absolute existence, there can be no nothingness, no night of inconscience, no deficiency, that is to say, no failure of force. For if there were any of these things, it would not be absolute. So also there can be no suffering, no negation of delight. So he is linking delight with absoluteness. If something is absolute and can express absolute force of consciousness, there can be no suffering and no negation of delight, because that would mean that it is not absolute. Whenever something is absolute, it means it is always full of delight. So he says now, absoluteness of conscious existence is illimitable bliss of conscious existence. The two are only different phrases for the same thing. All illimitableness, all infinity, all absoluteness is pure delight. So straight away, delight is identified with absoluteness, and he elaborates by showing the opposite condition, that when you do not have the absolute, that's when you have the problem of dissatisfaction. And he says, even in the human experience, we see this relationship. Even in our relative humanity, even our relative humanity has this experience that all dissatisfaction means a limit, an obstacle. Satisfaction comes by realization of something withheld, by the surpassing of the limit, the overcoming of the obstacle. So we see in the human experience, when are we dissatisfied? When something prevents, something blocks. There's some limitation we are not able to overcome, whether in ourselves or in our circumstances. On the other hand, when do we experience satisfaction? When something which was withheld has now been realized. We've broken through that barrier, we've crossed that limit, some obstacle has been overcome, and that's when we have this experience of satisfaction. And he says, this is because our original being is the absolute, in full possession of its infinite and illimitable self-consciousness and self-power. A self-possession whose other name is self-delight. And in proportion as the relative touches upon that self-possession, it moves towards satisfaction, touches delight. So when you think about it, all progress is a movement towards the absolute. Within the domain of relativity, we are always in relativity. There is always a relative progress. Something is overcome, something else remains to be overcome. But in the movement, we are not wandering in chaos as in a maze. We are moving towards the absolute. And each step towards that, where we overcome some limitation, some obstacle, or something which was hidden is now brought out and brought into expression. Each time it is a progress, it is a step closer towards the absolute, and its other name is self-delight. So this is a fascinating passage, just revealed in passing, but you see the relationship, the true nature of that delight is a recovery of our absolute nature. So, he says, the self-delight of Brahman is not limited to that stillness and motionless possession of his absolute self-being. Just as his force is capable of throwing itself into forms, so also his self-delight is capable of movement, of variation. And he says, of reveling in that infinite flux and mutability of itself represented by numberless teeming universes. So this self-delight is not only held within itself in its self-existence, but is actually expressed in that outburst of numberless teeming universes. To lose forth and enjoy this infinite movement and variation of its self-delight is the object of its extensive or creative play of force. So we find the whole universe born out of this choice, free choice, to enjoy its infinite variations of self-delight in movement, in form. So he further explains how, just as all objects are formed out of infinite force, even though they have a finite front, the same way in everything there exists that divine delight of existence, even though it has a finite front. It is formed out of that movement of infinite delight. And he says, in everything that is dwells the conscious force, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that conscious force. So also in everything that is, there is the delight of existence, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that delight. If even for a moment this supporting delight of existence is withdrawn, all would simply crumble. This is obvious in the more psychological structure of the human being, where we say, if we lost all sense of meaning, purpose, or delight, we would simply collapse as a personality. But it is true also of the atom and the subatomic particle. If there was not this delight supporting the movement of the force and the formation of that, it would simply crumble into formlessness. So here we have now two problems. Having placed this as the original cause and the deeper truth of all existence, he says there are two problems which come up in the human mind. The problem of, he says, two powerful contradictions, the emotional and sensational consciousness of pain and the ethical problem of evil. So in this chapter, he will deal with the problem of evil, of ethical problem of evil. And the next chapter, which we had briefly started last time, in the solution, he also discusses the problem of pain. But the problem here is, when we look at it from this perspective, if it is all infinite self-delight, how is it we have this universal experience of grief, suffering, or pain? In fact, he says, in the first perception, when we look at our life, it looks as if the burden of suffering and pain and grief is bigger than the joy and the happiness. It looks like that. But he says, this is actually an exaggeration of perspective and an error of perspective. If we look at things dispassionately, then we find that the sum of pleasure of existence far exceeds the sum of the pain of existence. Of course, there are variations with individuals or at certain times, but overall. And he says, behind the surface variations that we focus attention on, there is something which is the underlying pleasure of existence, and that is the normal state of nature. Pain is an occurrence which is temporarily suspending and overlaying that normal state. So even if we are doing nothing, the fact that we exist is for us a sense of deep satisfaction. And later he explains, this is the reason why there is the instinct of self-preservation. If there was not this satisfaction just to be, then if something comes to harm us, we would simply allow it. as happens when we are in states of extreme, exaggerated pain, whether real or imagined. At that point, we don't care if we live or die. We may even allow things to, as if, destroy us. But even as that happens, at the last moment, something from inside rebels and pushes forward and tries to hold and preserve rather than allow the destruction, which to the surface personality in pain seems to be just as good, or even perhaps a freedom from pain. But something deep inside pushes forward and says no, because there is behind that superficial extreme pain something deeper which does hold that pleasure of existence. And he consciously uses this word pleasure here because that's the domain of the human experience. And he says that's the reason why, because there is this underlying constant pleasure of experience, of existence everywhere at all times, that's the reason why we feel the pain to be that much more, because it is as if a contradiction of that normal base. And it affects us more intensely, seems to be larger than it actually is, seems to be greater than the sum of pleasure, because it is abnormal. And even the pleasure which is underlying, because it is constantly there, we do not treasure it, we do not even seek it, because it is already there. So we register it as something neutral, because we don't have to make an effort to get at it. Unless there is an exaggerated, intensified sensation of pleasure, then we pay attention. Otherwise, when it falls back to that normal base, that's normal. We don't have to make an effort. We don't need to seek it. Therefore, we register it as neutral. So here he's giving us a very deep perspective of this relationship that we have with pain, pleasure, and neutrality. So in that balance, we enter only positive pleasures on one side and discomfort and pain on the other. Pain affects us more intensely because it is abnormal to our being, contrary to our natural tendency, and is experienced as an outrage on our experience, on our existence, an offense, an external attack on what we are and seek to be. And that's why pain acquires this exaggerated place. But still, the whole problem boils down to this: why at all is there pain and suffering? All being Satchidananda, how can pain and suffering at all exist? This, the real problem, is what he now takes up. But then he says, this problem is further complicated by a false issue which starts with the idea of a personal, extra-cosmic God and the ethical difficulty. And this is what he now discusses. And this is fascinating, this next paragraph. In a single paragraph, he outlines all the different solutions that various religions and philosophies have placed before us for solving this problem. So first, the problem is stated in these terms: Satchidananda, it may be reasoned, is God, is a conscious being who is the author of existence. How then can God have created a world in which he inflicts suffering on his creatures, sanctions pain, permits evil? God being all good, who created pain and evil? So we, of course, find in many religions this solution that, well, pain is a trial, it's an ordeal, and we have to go through it. But still, he says, that doesn't solve the problem. It still makes the problem worse. God, who is all good, all moral, all wonderful, creates a universe where you have to suffer through pain and go through it as a trial, even for your own good. It doesn't make sense. It is a test, we may say, but again, that seems to be a perverse God. He likes to test you with pain and suffering so that you may prove yourself to be what? And he creates pain and suffering. It looks almost like a perverse being. So we come to this conclusion that God is immoral or non-moral. He is an excellent world mechanist, perhaps, a cunning psychologist, but not a God of good and of love whom we can worship. Only a God of might, to whose law we must submit, or whose caprice we may hope to propitiate. And you'll see this formed in many old religions, that they create this relationship of fear to God. You have to propitiate God and keep giving Him special gifts. Sometimes even your own suffering is offered as a gift, so that He may be happy and then give you some happiness and pleasure. So you have to submit because it is a law He has created. So you find this term, and here I will draw on specific examples of religions because these are implied and these are quite strong in those religious formations. You will see in the Abrahamic tradition 3 religions which have emerged, and both of the older ones have this aspect of the might which is very prominent. In Judaism and in Islam, the power of God, the might of God, the law of God to whom we would submit is made very important. And there is this idea that you have to propitiate, and the law is given, it is revealed. You can't question it. That's how it is. Whereas in the later form of Christianity, we find the attempt to move back to this God of good and God of love that you can worship with love. And yet, in the form in which the church actually articulates it to the public, it plays on this double. On the one hand, God is good and loving. On the other hand, He is all might and has wrath and anger, which you must propitiate, and you must be careful to negotiate in between. There is a fourth position, which is the Buddhist view, which he will come to shortly. And you'll see in all these, he covers broadly all the large viewpoints that religions have. So he says, a God who invents torture as a means of test or ordeal can be convicted of deliberate cruelty, moral insensibility, and as a moral being, he is definitely inferior to the human, because he creates torture as a method of growth. Also, when we look at punishment, it's a moral evil. Why should he punish? Because after all, when we make a mistake, it comes either from some mental sickness or from some ignorance. Very rarely do we find intentional mistakes. And where we find that persistent, we say that person has a damaged mind. He has a damaged psychology. That's why he intentionally chooses a perverse mistake. So why should ignorance and mental illness be punished by the most extreme forms of punishment? So again, we find that this kind of God is almost a monstrous being. Even if we say it is karma, you created the actions of which the results hit you now. Maybe in some life before, you don't remember it. And this is the solution which is given in many of the Eastern traditions, in Hinduism, in Buddhism. But still the question remains, why should God create a universe where you have to suffer the consequences of your own ignorance, even if in another life? Why at all the law of karma is like this? And the problem remains, you still see a morally evil, perverse form of God. So the solution which Buddhism comes to, it's interesting. The inexorable law of karma is irreconcilable with the supreme moral and personal deity. And therefore the clear logic of Buddha denied the existence of any free and all-governing personal God. All personality he declared to be a creation of ignorance and subject to karma. So in the Buddhist view now, God himself is thrown out because it's contradictory to have a morally good God with this form of karma. So karma alone is the reality. There is no such thing as a personal governing God. Now Sri Aurobindo comes to the solution. The solution is so simple and yet profound. And now we will appreciate the text we have been studying. He says, in truth, The difficulty thus sharply presented arises only if we assume the existence of an extra cosmic personal God. The whole problem comes from this, because we have conceived of God as outside the cosmos, as a personal being outside. Who is watching this cosmos? Who has created the cosmos and has inflicted upon it all this suffering? Not himself the universe, one who has created good and evil, pain and suffering for his creatures, but himself stands above and unaffected by them, watching, ruling, doing his will with a suffering and struggling world, allowing the world to be driven by an inexorable law, unhelped by him. And all of this problem starts with this God sitting outside, not omnipotent, not all good and all loving. What's the other correction he says? Himself, he is the universe. On no theory of an extra cosmic moral God can evil and suffering be explained, the creation of evil and suffering, except by an unsatisfactory subterfuge. And he refers to a teaching called Manichaeanism. Now, this is no more surviving, but it is also one of the options which was briefly developed and belongs to certain religious orders even today. And the idea there is God is not all powerful. There is God, and then there is the opposite, the dark being, whatever name is given to it, and the two are continuously fighting. And all human experience emerges from that struggle, and we are ourselves the playground for their struggle. God is not all powerful. He has to struggle. We have to participate in that struggle, and we have to make choices. He cannot compel because he is not all powerful. He himself is fighting to survive against that dark energy. So with this, Sri Aurobindo describes this. It attempts to justify this appearance of evil and suffering, but as an excuse. And it avoids the problem by annulling the Godhead in attempt to justify its ways or excuse its works. But he says, such a God is not the Vedantic Satchidananda. Satchidananda of the Veda is one existence without a second. All that is He. If then evil and suffering exist, it is He that bears the evil and suffering in the creature in whom He has embodied Himself. The problem then changes entirely. Now our whole perspective changes. And in fact, the question which was asked in the beginning, why God creates this universe where pain, suffering, evil, etc. exist, that question has no place anymore. The problem then changes entirely. The question is no longer how God came to create for His creatures a suffering and evil, of which He is Himself incapable and therefore immune. But how came, and this is the question, how came the soul and infinite existence consciousness bliss to admit into itself that which is not bliss, that which seems to be its positive negation? So now we are seeing God not as this extra cosmic person, but as Himself, the whole manifestation, including. He is immune perhaps to suffering, but in the manifestation we find this experience of suffering, but that is also Himself. So the question now is, how can this pain and suffering appear in a cosmos which is Himself immune of pain and suffering, which is Himself all bliss? In fact, it is He that bears the evil and suffering in the creatures in whom He has embodied Himself. So the whole moral question now passes. At least half the moral question passes. That difficulty in its one unanswerable form disappears. Cruelty to others while I remain free, that is no more part of the picture. What exists rather is self-infliction of suffering, I being the sole existence. But that is a different issue now. Now he says, at this point still, the ethical difficulty may be brought back in a modified form. If all delight is necessarily all good and all love, how can evil and suffering exist in Satchidananda? since all existence is emerging from a free and conscious being. He is also free to condemn and reject evil and suffering. So, how is it that he has allowed this evil and suffering to appear? Now here he says, for the solution, we have to shift our perspective. So far, this question is an ethical question. How has he allowed this evil and suffering to come in? And it's an ethical question. But we have to understand that this question itself does not exist at a certain level of evolution. The question appears only in us as human beings. And so we have to step back from this perspective of individual meeting individual and experiencing evil and suffering, and look at the totality of the cosmos, and from this perspective answer the question. And then we can review it in the context of the individual. So he says we shift our vision to the whole, not limiting ourselves only to the human standpoint. And then we see that the whole of nature is not driven by ethical standards. In nature, the law is a fixed pattern of habits. And when the tiger kills the deer, then we don't blame the tiger. Or when fire burns and destroys, or a storm wipes out, we don't blame the storm, nor in the fire or the storm or in the tiger is the sense of guilt. It is just a universal force moving in various forms along fixed grooves and habits. There is no blame, there is no condemnation of another, nor self-blame or self-condemnation. In the human being, the self-condemnation or condemnation of another emerges, and he says that's the beginning of ethics. And where does this come from? In us, he says, the fear of the deer for the tiger, the rage of the strong creature against its assailant, is a vital recoil of the individual delight of existence from that which threatens it. So the source of this ethical form emerging also goes back to the delight of existence. Because the delight of existence in the individual is as if threatened by that external assault, there is a recoil. And this recoil refines itself as the mind develops into repugnance, dislike, and then eventually disapproval when mind is fully detached from the situation. Disapproval of that which threatens and hurts us, approval of that which flatters and satisfies, refine into the conception of good and evil to oneself, to the community, to others than ourselves, to other communities than ours, and finally into the general approval of good, the general approval of evil, the general disapproval of evil. Now at this point he is describing how this grows in evolution. First there's the individual experience, and we find over time these patterns are harmful to the delight of existence organized in my existence, and so I begin to see it as bad. This supports, and so it is good. And then I see a generalized perception among others, communities, and so on, until as the mind widens now to view the whole of humanity, it has made a generalized conception of good and evil and a response to that. But all of this belongs to a certain domain of the mental development and mental experience. But throughout, the fundamental nature of the thing remains the same. Man desires self-expression, self-development. In other words, the progressing play in himself of the conscious force of existence. That is his fundamental delight. So behind it all this, there is this fundamental delight of existence which is pushing for self-expression and self-development. Whatever hurts that self-expression, self-development, satisfaction of his progressing self is for him evil. Whatever helps, confirms, raises, aggrandizes, ennobles it, his good. Only his conception of the self-development changes, becomes higher and wider, begins to exceed his limited personality, to embrace others, to embrace all in its scope. So this basic principle that we are always trying to express and develop ourselves as part of this principle of delight which is emerging and trying to manifest, that is common throughout. But the conception of what is the nature of our development, that grows as we grow. In other words, the conclusion is this: ethics is a stage in evolution. That which is common to all stages, even before ethics and after ethics, that which is common to all stages is the urge of Satchidananda towards self-expression. This urge is at first non-ethical. You don't see ethics in matter. Then infra-ethical in the animal. Then in the intelligent animal, even anti-ethical. For it permits us to approve hurt done to others, which we disapprove when done to ourselves. So this is an interesting passage. Intelligent animal. And you see, in the animal there is no deliberate intent to hurt another. But when intelligence develops and we have an intelligent animal, then we may approve the hurt of another. Unfortunately, a large part of humanity lives in this still. And you will see in even till the present, but much more extensively, a few hundred years ago barely, instruments of tortures invented by human beings to make torture more painful and to make it last longer. And yet the very people who make it do not want that applied to themselves. So this he describes as anti-ethical, but that's also a passage in the emergence of ethics. In this respect, man even now is only half ethical. And just as all below us is infra-ethical, so there may be that above us, whither we shall eventually arrive, which is supra-ethical, has no need of ethics. So at this point we see ethics as a passage, a band in the transition of consciousness from the non-ethical through the infra-ethical to something which is supra-ethical. And at that point, as we grow into that larger universality in a higher harmony, ethics may have no place, no relevance. It may not even be possible to keep ethical values there, since the qualities and oppositions on which it depends will naturally dissolve and disappear in the final reconciliation. You see, ethic survives on certain qualities and certain oppositions. We are different beings. We have certain qualities which we cherish. Now ethics starts. The moment you say we are one conscious common humanity, one family, and our priorities have now shifted, suddenly ethics has no place anymore. In the universal cosmic consciousness, where one experiences all forms, all beings as oneself, my own other bodies, there is no place for such a conception anymore. That is why you find in the spiritual path sometimes, the spiritual teacher may cause the disciple to pass through certain hardships as a means for his awakening and growth. But he does it with love, with compassion. And at each step he is there supporting him, lifting him, even carrying in him the burden of his difficulty or suffering. If only the disciple could be a little more conscious. And when having crossed that difficulty, the disciple looks back and can see the love and compassion with which the Guru led him through that painful passage to bring him to something which he could not have otherwise realized on his own. And this is what we all go through in our spiritual journey, whether the Guru is human or divine. He carries us through those painful transitions sometimes. But there is no question of ethics there. There is no other way. Our goal here is to grow, outgrow our limitations, and sometimes it may mean breaking certain barriers which resist, and they could be a painful transition. So now we come back to our question. He says, if the ethical standpoint now is only a temporary passage from one universality below to another universality. The lower universality is this where everything is one universal mechanical force. The higher universality is everything is one conscious divine force, blissful. And in between is this passage. And in between appears this ethics. So he says we cannot apply, therefore, ethics to the total solution of the problem of the universe. It's only one element in the total solution. And to be able to see the full picture, we have to see that the world has three layers: infra-ethical, ethical, and supra-ethical. We have to find that which is common to all, for only so can we resolve the problem. So since this whole question is universal, we can't limit ourselves to just the ethical. We have to see what is common to all three levels. And what is common? That which is common to all is, we have seen, the satisfaction of conscious force of existence, developing itself into forms and seeking in that development its delight. This you find in the infra-ethical, even in matter. In the ethical, in human beings, and in the supra-ethical, the same thing continues. We reread, that which is common to all is, we have seen, the satisfaction of conscious force of existence developing itself into forms and seeking in that development its delight. In a sense, we may say, this is the worldview of the psychic being within us. It is developing itself into forms and seeking in that development its delight. But the form is not merely the individual form, there is also something much larger. From that satisfaction or delight of self-existence, it evidently began. For it is that which is normal to it, to which it clings, which it makes its base. But it seeks new forms of itself, and in the passage to higher forms, there intervenes the phenomenon of pain and suffering, which seems to contradict the fundamental nature of its being. This, and this alone, is the root problem. So now all of our general confusion of perspective, all those questions we have asked of God and says, why so much pain, why me, why that, why this, all of them boil down to this one thing. For that satisfaction of delight of self-existence, it began, it clings to it, makes it its base, but it seeks new forms of itself, and in the passage to higher forms, there intervenes the phenomenon of pain and suffering, which seems to contradict the fundamental nature of its being. Now here's the key word, it seems to contradict. And we will see the resolution, the bulk of which will be in the next chapter, but in this one already many things have been clarified. But before proceeding, he takes up one more solution which has been thrown up, and this is present in several philosophies which have appeared, which still exist, even partly in certain religions. So he asks this question, how shall we solve it? Shall we say that Satchidananda is not the beginning and end of things, but the beginning and end is nihil, an impartial void, itself nothing but containing all potentialities of existence or non-existence, consciousness or non-consciousness, delight or undelight? We may accept this answer if we choose. And then he goes on to say, what is the implication? But although we seek thereby to explain everything, we have really explained nothing. We have only included everything. So what this answer does really is it says the original is a void, where all things exist already as a potential, including bliss and non-bliss, and existence and non-existence, etc. You will find this, for example, in the Buddhist resolution of the problem. But he says it's actually explained nothing. All you have done is you have created something which includes all of these contradictions, but doesn't explain why. Why did they come to be? Why do these contradictions exist in this all-potential void? He says, a nothing, capital N, a nothing which is full of all potentialities is the most complete opposition of terms and things possible. We have therefore only explained a minor contradiction by a major, by driving the self-contradiction of things to their maximum. Nihil is the void where there can be no potentialities, and impartial, indeterminate of all potentialities is chaos. And all that we have done is to put chaos into the void without explaining how it got there. This is the problem. Suddenly everything is piled up pell-mell in that void. How did it get there doesn't matter, but somehow it comes out and that explains, but it doesn't explain anything. It only shifts the problem to a different level and makes it bigger. So he drops this line, he says, let us return then to our original conception of Satchidananda and see whether on that foundation a completer solution is not possible. Now, before he goes to the actual solution, which is in the next chapter, he clarifies now what it is that we are exploring. We are looking for an understanding of this delight of existence. Where is this? What is this Ananda? Where is it from? What is it doing here? And so we need to first understand what we mean by it. Because after all, we have seen the human experience is only a reflection or a distortion of it. What is it in itself? And this he now clarifies. And this portion I am going to read now in some detail because it's extremely important. We must first make it clear to ourselves that just as when we speak of universal consciousness, we mean something different from, more essential and wider than the waking mental consciousness of the human being. So also when we speak of universal delight of existence, we mean something different from, more essential and wider than the ordinary emotional and sensational pleasure of the individual human creature. You will find in many popular teachings, they make the Ananda nothing but an exaggeration of human pleasure or human sensation. But it would be a perversion, it would be an error to make that connection. It is something different. Different from, more essential and wider. These are the three words, both with universal consciousness and with this universal delight of existence. When we look at universal consciousness, the way we conceive of it normally is to say, oh, I am conscious, my consciousness, now widening until it includes the whole universe, that would be universal consciousness. But that's an error. It's not this mental consciousness becoming larger or exaggerated. After all, universal consciousness should continue even when you are asleep, isn't it? It should continue also when you are in an exalted state. So there has to be something common to all of them, which is what makes universal consciousness, and not merely this superficial mental formation of awareness. So it is different from, more essential because it has to span all of those gradations of consciousness, and of course wider because it has to include all things, even the consciousness or non-consciousness of the stone, as also the consciousness of plant, animal, human, and God. In the same way, the universal delight of existence is different from the ordinary emotional and sensational pleasure of the individual human creature. It is more essential because remember, it has to be there even in the stone and in the plant, in the animal, even in the supernova exploding. It is part of that universal delight of existence. And more essential, different from, more essential, and wider in the same way. Pleasure, joy, and delight, as man uses the words, are limited and occasional movements which depend on certain habitual causes and emerge like their opposites, pain and grief, which are equally limited and occasional movements, from a background other than themselves. So here's the interesting distinction. What we call in the human experience pleasure or joy or delight. It comes out of a background and it is different from the background out of which it comes. The same for pain and suffering. Delight of being is universal, illimitable, and self existent, not dependent on particular causes. The background of all backgrounds, from which pleasure, pain, and other neutral experiences emerge. So, first of all, human experience of joy has a cause. It comes from this situation, from this arrangement, from this contact, from this sensation, from this arrangement of my nerves, from this state of my mind. The same thing, which may be a caress in a certain state of my mind, pleasurable, may be the very opposite in a different state of my mind. So it depends on so many things to fall in place, but that pattern habitually repeated gives me that joy or pleasure or delight. But all the time those sensations emerge out of something and they're different from the background. And so they can lapse back and cease. Whereas the universal delight, the delight of being is universal, illimitable, and self-existent. So it doesn't depend on causes, particular arrangements. It doesn't have a background out of which it emerges, into which it can lapse. It is the background of all backgrounds, from which all these experiences come. So, when delight of being seeks to realize itself as delight of becoming, it moves in the movement of force and itself takes different forms of movement, of which pleasure and pain are positive and negative currents. So now we're coming to the whole crux of this process. There are two phrases here: delight of being and delight of becoming. When the divine is in his absolute delight, without manifesting himself, without choosing to explore and experience the varied multifacetedness of his own delight, he simply rests in it. That is the delight of being. When he moves into awareness of his own delight and chooses to experience them in all their infinite multiplicities, then this delight of being moves into delight of becoming, seeks to realize itself as delight of becoming, and seeks to know himself in his delight through all these different facets and ways of knowing. So it moves in the movement of force. This is, remember how consciousness of Satchidananda, the consciousness dwelling on itself, draws out from it all of these possibilities of the world. He chooses to know himself in every way. And that knowing is itself the power to draw out and manifest. At the same time, in that consciousness is the cause of it all, the delight to know himself and the delight to draw out and manifest. And in that different movements, forms of movements, and it seeks to manifest in different forms, in the forms of movements there are currents. A current which is positive is pleasure, a current which is negative is pain. Now, what do we mean by positive and negative? And what we realize in deeper exploration is what we call positive and negative is itself relative. What is positive for me may be negative for another, and vice versa. But they are currents. Depending on how they relate to me, they are positive or negative, and therefore pleasure or pain. Now this movement, subconscient in matter, superconscient beyond mind, this delight seeks in mind and life to realize itself by emergence in the becoming, in the increasing self-consciousness of the movement. So the delight exists even in matter. It will continue even in the supraconscious, but in life and mind, where consciousness is being organized, and especially individualized consciousness, this delight is emerging and trying to organize and express itself. And so as the first part of its emergence and organization, its first phenomenon are dual and impure, move between the poles of pleasure and pain. but it aims at its self-revelation in the purity of a supreme delight of being, which is self-existent and independent of objects and causes. So at first, when it organizes in the individual, it moves between these poles of pleasure and pain. But you see, behind it, what is the deepest striving we have? We're looking for a sustained delight. We seek that delight to be constant and to be growing and to be expressed more and more. That is its intention ultimately. Just as Satchidananda moves towards the realization of the universal existence in the individual and of the form exceeding consciousness in the form of body and mind, so it moves towards the realization of universal, self-existent and objectless delight in the flux of particular experiences and objects. Remember, the whole game of this manifestation was to manifest that totality in form, in limited appearance, and in mind and body. So first it was universal existence which was sought to be realized in the individual, universal consciousness to be to be realized in the individual consciousness, and similarly its universal delight to be manifested in this particularity of individuality and forms and arrangements of experience. But what happens to us? We catch the forms and the circumstances. Those objects we now seek as stimulating causes of a transient pleasure and satisfaction. When I eat chocolate, I experience this pleasure and satisfaction. Of course, if I eat too much, then I experience the very opposite. Or if I eat the same thing every day, after a while, it subsides into the background level and it no more gives me the same. I need a new experience. So we are grabbing at the object through which it manifested and hoping to catch it in the object and from the object. Free, possessed of self, we shall not seek, but shall possess them as reflectors rather than causes of a delight which eternally exists. So when we recover that true freedom, we do not seek the delight in objects. We have the delight already, and it is eternally there. But through these experiences, we reflect that delight in all its variations. That is the nature of the world experience when we are free. And we at the last paragraph of this chapter, he says, in the egoistic human being, and ego here is the sense of separation and limitation. In the egoistic human being, the mental person emergent out of the dim shell of matter, delight of existence is neutral, semi-latent, still in the shadow of the subconscious, hardly more than a concealed soil of plenty, covered by desire, with a luxuriant growth of poisonous weeds and hardly less poisonous flowers, the pains and pleasures of our egoistic existence. So this is the description, the analogy, and this image is very important. It is the Vedic image. As we have emerged, the soil is this base. And out of that we have weeds and flowers which are poisonous. That is what we experience as the pains and pleasures of the egoistic existence. What's the change that takes place? When the divine conscious force working secretly in us has devoured these growths of desire, when in the image of the Rig Veda the fire of God has burnt up the shoots of earth, that which is concealed at the roots of these pains and pleasures, their cause and secret being, the sap of delight in them will emerge in new forms, not of desire, but of self-existent satisfaction, which will replace mortal pleasure by the immortal's ecstasy. And this transformation is possible because these growths of sensation and emotion are in their essential being, the pains and no less than the pleasures, that delight of existence which they seek but fail to reveal. Fail because of division, ignorance of self, and egoism. So what we see is behind everything, at the base, it is the delight of existence which is seeking to realize and organize itself. But because of the division and ignorance of self and egoism, there is this distortion which creates the opposite appearance, but it is still appearance. Now, the solution of how this appearance comes about and how it is to be resolved is the theme of the next chapter, Delight of Existence, the Solution, which we will continue next Sunday. You see, in one chapter, where he is discussing the problem, he has already given us so many solutions. He has taken this whole confused state of the human thought and experience and brought about such clarity and gone to the core of the whole problem, still in the context of this larger vision that all is a manifestation of delight, meant to manifest and ultimately fulfill and realize that delight. And now the solution to our surviving problem is what we will take up next. So we will close with the last sentence of the text we had been studying and meditate on that. And this is Sri Aurobindo telling us, as commanded by the divine, I shall only expound the bliss, removing obscurity, radiate the bliss, you who are its children. And now you see how this sentence has such a more profound meaning. Sri Aurobindo himself removes the obscurity which prevents us from recognizing the bliss and brings us to our own reawakening of our innate bliss, we who are its children.